Good evening. It's nice and cold out there tonight. Um, Tonight I want to talk about logistics or military logistics. Military logistics is defined as the efficient management and movement of materials like ammunition and supplies, men, and the movement of weapon systems. And in today's fights, you have to have logistics. It reflects just how professional an army works, or how a war is going, for example. Um, Historically, when we think about logistics, up until World War One, wars used to drag out for years, for a very long time, and that was mainly down to the fact that they had to take production of weapons into consideration. They had slow modes of transport like sail ships and donkeys, and of course, generals and command on the battlefield would they wouldn't have very good communication lines, so it would be very difficult for them to make very informed decisions. So it really started to pick up pace in the First World War with the invention of the diesel engine and the tank. And I suppose the best the best example of logistics working, the first example would of course be the Blitzkrieg, or the German method of invasion, where what they would do was they would organize their units into small, fast moving groups of armored vehicles. And what they would do is they'd go around an obstacle, like for example the Maginot Line up in France. What they did there was they swept south down through the Ardennes forest and around, and before the commanders who were defending the line knew about it, they were surrounded and neutralized. Um, so that was an example of the Lightning War, where the idea was movement was key, and to move the assets around the battlefield as quickly as possible before the defense could mount any sort of defense against it. Um, Furthermore, later on in the Second World War, we saw the limitations of logistics, where the German army, they invaded eastwards into Russia and Ukraine, and the problems there was that they had stretched out, their advances had stretched out so far that their supply lines could not keep up with them, and they couldn't uh, and they weren't able to continue the momentum that they were able to do in France, in southern France and Central Europe. Another interesting point in the Second World War, um, you had the introduction, in the later stages of the war, Hitler introduced the V weapons, which were rockets, which he was firing at England. And these missiles would travel at supersonic speeds, and there was absolutely no defense against them. And they were a devastating weapon. However, the Germans, the production of those particular missiles and the amount of engineering that went into them meant that they couldn't produce them in as massive quantities as they would produce artillery shells. So, in the end, a weapon that could have won the war was they simply could not do it, down to logistics and the ability to produce those weapons. Um, Another thing, what we noticed from further on, later on into the 80s, 90s, and noughties, there's the idea of power projection. For example, where the United States Navy, they're able to they have aircraft carrier groups that can travel around the world on nuclear power, and anywhere in the world, anywhere there's any conflict, there's a battle group ready and waiting, and simply within, instead of taking weeks or months to mount an operation, it would only be a matter of hours, even days or hours, before some sort of operation could be taken in whatever part of the world. Another example would be the United States Air Force or NATO being able to refuel their planes while in the sky as well. It basically means that the Air Force can literally travel to any part of the globe in the space of hours and do whatever it needs to be done there. And that's down through logistics, very sophisticated logistics involving the coordination of tankers over the oceans and the seas, the ability to distribute fuel, and the movement of material, weapons, and weapon systems, and people. Today, the logistics war is very apparent in the Ukraine war. For example, the movement of weapons into Ukraine to defend Ukraine from Europe it's done through road, rail, and even in through the air. Likewise, over on the Russian side as well. Interesting points to note that I've noticed in the war. In terms of there's a lot of footage there on YouTube with drones dropping mortar bombs on exposed trenches with Russian soldiers in them. There's drones dropping mortar bombs right down on top, right through the turret of a tank, blowing it up. And there's examples of a drone just coming across a big pile of weapons or ammunition dump and just blowing it all sky high. And I was thinking about that, and it's actually they've really perfected the art of looking at logistics for what they've done. For example, like when the Russians overtook most of Ukraine, the Ukrainians were able to push them back because, firstly, the Russians, they didn't expect this war to last longer than 48 hours. And 9 months later, it's very apparent that they never wanted this war in the first place. Secondly, when it comes to they're very exposed. For example, the drones, they go out. You'd have one batch of drones, and they'd be the observer force, and they'd be sent out a whole scatter of directions. And what they would do is they would be looking for signs, and they'd be looking for tracks. Okay, so the tracks go one way. They go two ways. Obviously, one way would be the wrong way. The other way, you just follow those tracks, and what the drone would observe would either be a hastily built up defense like a trench, or a badly camouflaged weapons dump, or there would be you'd come up and you'd find a main battle tank. And then what the drone would do, it would relay those GPS coordinates back to the killer drones, and those drones would have plenty of time and quite efficiently they do a beeline straight for that position, do the job, and come back home before anybody's the wiser. And that's an example of very poor logistics, very bad planning logistics on the Russian side, very hasty logistics done on the Russian side. And as a consequence of that, right now, last week I was saying that the Ukrainians are looking to do a counterattack, hopefully in the Zaporizhia area, to go down and take on Mariupol and Melitopol. However, recent reports have shown that there is a counterattack going on right way up northeast country. It looks like they're going to move on Svatova, which is the extreme northern end of the conflict. And what I find interesting about that is the previous few weeks, the Ukrainian forces were massing up for a counteroffensive in the Kherson area. Now, obviously, the Kherson area fell. So, in the space of a couple of weeks, it'll be interesting to see, have they actually moved all the men, material, and weapon systems way up north? Logistically, it sounds massive, incredible. You know, that would be an incredible move to move something like 600 kilometers, to move thousands of men, tons of equipment, hundreds of thousands of tons of supplies and machinery way up north. And from a military point of view, it would be something that would not be expected, especially by the Russians, because even for the Russians to react to something like that, they would have to be able to respond in kind as well. They'd have to pull their resources from the south part of the country and move them up as fast as possible into the northern end of the country. So there you see, there's the logistics race. So it'll be interesting to see how it pans out, how it plays out, and maybe later on when we get an opportunity to look back on the war, was that the case? Did they actually move all that material right up north? Because if they did, it's a stroke of genius, because it's something I wouldn't expect that. That's a phenomenal a phenomenal feat of logistics and planning. Um, Getting back to the whole logistics side on hastily prepared defenses and the tracks, for example, it would be a very different story when it comes to the Donetsk area, because way back, as we all know, um, there was always fighting going on in the Donetsk region since 2014. And since then, defense lines have been dug. There's a whole network of roads there so that tanks and armored vehicles and whatever vehicles can travel up and down, and they won't be leaving any signs that they're of their activity. So it'll be much harder for drones to spot that kind of activity. They'd have to catch them on the fly. And secondly, in terms of defensive positions, like those trenches would have been dug 3, 4, 5, 6 years ago. So they're all greened over and camouflaged, and there'll be all sorts of scrub and bushes and trees breaking that up. Like you wouldn't even notice you're going into an enemy position until you're literally on top of it, and it'll be very difficult to spot them. So it'll be very hard to spot those defensive positions, and also like in terms of moving artillery and heavy machinery, um, they would have pre-designated spots, defensive spots, planned out exactly, so that like if one position fell, they'll know exactly where to regroup and follow in there. So logistically, the Russians or the Russian backed forces will be very fierce. There would be very fierce resistance. And finally, in terms of supplies, those supplies, you're talking about tunnels, you're talking about buildings that will be disguised as farmyards, but in fact they're reinforced concrete and steel, and they would contain all the weapons and the supplies and everything the soldiers need to fight and to resist. So my my predictions for the war going forward would be that for the likes of Crimea, yeah, Crimea might be a bit of a problem as well, but definitely the north part of the country, Melitopol and Mariupol, around the Kherson region there as well, um, they can be easily taken back. However, it's going to be much more difficult to take on the Donetsk region and possibly the Crimean region. However, Crimea wasn't really ready for a fight, so I'd say that would be priority two. Um, so that's all I have to say. Take care.